Hey guys, this is Jessica Post and I'm the camp director.
This is Shauna Lee and I'm the assistant camp director. You can follow along with the slides in this video, and if you want more details, you can click on the link that takes you to the training manual. Where do our kids come from? A lot of our kids are coming from broken homes, generational poverty, high crime, etc. Oftentimes, these children are dealing with things such as abandonment, loss, and grief issues of depression. It could be with their family or friends or other relatives. They also can deal with attachment dysfunctions, sensory processing deficits such as a lack of touch while they were babies, or common things such as loud noises or needing shoes or staying wet for too long can bother them. They can also deal with fear, anger, shame, or anxiety, physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, or something as simple as a lack of food or not a stable, nutritious diet. It's very common for a parent to give money for snack food, but not for things like dinner. Or they can deal with some other traumatic issues. Because of these issues, sometimes it's hard to love some of these kids, and they can seem like a bother, but it's our job to make every effort to show these kids how we live according to God's standards and that we love all of them, no matter what.
As recently as the 1980s, scientists believed a child's brain at birth was fairly static, largely predetermined by genetics. Researchers now know that's not true. While genetics clearly play a role, scientists know that relationships and experiences shape the brain. Think of a developing brain like a multi-storied house under construction. In this chapter, we'll explore the basics of brain development and help you understand how early traumatic experiences can design a different house. When we're born, our brains are teeming with more than 100 billion neurons or brain cells. Under optimal conditions, when our needs are met consistently by nurturing caregivers,
You got a red ball.
our brains thrive. These neurons connect in complex and vast networks, much like the electrical wiring in a modern home.
The baby comes with all this wiring, but it's the human interaction, looking into the eyes, being held, hearing the song of my mother, feeling the strong shoulder of my daddy, that begin to make the brain develop in very, very important ways for all of the life skills that will come.
At birth, the lower floors, or the downstairs part of the brain, is firmly wired in place by genetics, allowing a child to breathe, eat, sleep, and hear. Survival functions are rooted here. Very few connections in the upper floors are formed. These more sophisticated parts of the brain govern higher functions: complex thought, reasoning, emotional processing, memory, speech, and most importantly, the ability to regulate our behavior. It takes time and repeated experiences for this circuitry to develop and become hardwired in the brain. When a child experiences trauma, abuse, neglect, or other risk factors, it can skew the wiring of the brain, as well as the structure and the chemistry. The lower, more primitive survival part of the brain can overdevelop from reacting to fear, while the critical upper floors may underdevelop and suffer.
In the book that I wrote with Dan Siegel, The Whole Brain Child, we talk about an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. For some kids,
Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates, Director of Parenting Education for the Mindsight Institute in California, and best-selling author along with Mindsight Executive Director Dr. Dan Siegel.
the upstairs brain is the more sophisticated part of the brain. It's our cortex that takes a long, long time to develop. And it's the part of the brain that allows us to regulate our emotions and calm down our bodies, understand ourselves, understand other people, and really be able to make good choices and be flexible and adaptive. The downstairs brain is much more primitive. It's actually really well developed at birth, and it's the limbic area and the brainstem connected to the body. And that part of the brain is much more reactive, and its job is to kind of constantly be watching for how to keep us alive.
Dr. Bryson's research and studies in attachment science child rearing theory, and interpersonal neurobiology have made her a sought-after expert contributor with appearances on Good Morning America, PBS, and Red Book magazine. She says trauma triggers the watchdog part of the lower brain, called the amygdala, to work overtime.
And its job is to constantly sort of scan the environment, to be paranoid a little bit, to be watching, is everything okay here? Am I okay? Am I safe? Is anyone out to get me? Can I relax? And that part of the brain is always appraising what's going on around us, reading faces, reading the environment.
Do you like bubblegum?
Yeah.
No.
When children feel threatened or overwhelmed with fear, they may fight, run away, or shut down. The brain kicks into survival response, which researchers called fight, flight, or freeze survival mode. If the brain stays in this state too long because of trauma, it reorganizes around survival at the expense of healthy development of other parts of the brain.
So for a child who's had repeated exposure to fearful experiences, whether those be sort of a trauma like a car accident, or whether it's developmental or relational trauma, where the caregiver was frightening or they were left for long periods of time to manage their own fear states. The downstairs brain has gotten a lot of practice being active. It's the repeated experiences that we have that actually activate growth and connection in the brain. So if a child has had a lot of experiences where their downstairs brain that was reactive and fearful, that part of the brain gets really well developed. Whereas then the upstairs brain that knows how to calm that fear and kind of do that self-soothing, like, oh, that was a scary noise, but I'm okay now. That part of the brain may not be as well developed in children who have had repeated fearful experiences.
The impact goes beyond the upper and lower floors. The fear and stress of trauma also affect the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which help coordinate logic and emotion.
The left brain specializes in logical, literal, linear, and linguistic, which is using words, in those modes of processing information and going about in the world. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is much more closely connected to emotion, to sensations in our bodies, to kind of looking at the whole picture as opposed to bits and pieces, and more random ways of processing information as opposed to linear. And the important part is that they work together as a coordinated whole. When children are in situations where their needs are not responded to, where their emotional states are not understood, or there is not a caregiver who responds consistently, quickly, and in an attuned way, the right hemisphere does not get nurtured. It doesn't get developed optimally. So when one side takes over, we can either be cut off from our emotions or we can become flooded by them.
It's not just our emotional balance that gets upset by trauma. It also disturbs the delicate balance between our brain chemistry and the hormones that drive our central nervous system and our entire being. In times of stress, our bodies produce the hormone cortisol, revving our bodies to a state of high alert. Periodic stress and short bursts of cortisol actually stimulate growth and help us adapt and change. When stress stays too high for too long, toxic levels of cortisol become corrosive and can lead to a host of long-term problems. Rockefeller University neuroscience professor Dr. Bruce McEwen is noted for his pioneering work on the impact of stress on the brain.
In a chronic stress situation, our lab has shown that dendrites in some parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, will shrink and communication will be impaired.
Most critically, Dr. McEwen says chronic stress takes a heavy toll on the vital front part of the brain that controls emotion, memory, and attention.
The prefrontal cortex is very vulnerable, and when there is chaos in a child's life, lack of good attachment, development of the prefrontal cortex is severely affected. And it's involved in the downstream control of everything that's going on, whether it's impulsivity, whether it's aggression, anxiety. It helps control mood. It helps a person make decisions when to stop something, to do something else. It's the brain area that is so important for self-regulation, which is so important for success in everything that we do as adults.
Dr. McEwen is a best-selling author, former president of the Society for Neuroscience, and expert contributor for the PBS series This Emotional Life.
Early life adversity and toxic stress is often associated with increased frequency of disorders like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, as well as brain problems such as substance abuse, antisocial behavior, depression.
When a child stays in elevated states of stress, that cortisol stress hormone washes over the brain and washes through their body. And we know that brains that are exposed to chronic cortisol look different from healthy brains.
And I'm wondering if we can outline the paper.
Doctors Karen Purvis and David Cross have conducted extensive testing on children who have experienced early harm. They've found severe imbalances in cortisol and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers the brain sends the body. Some excite and some calm, and trauma can dramatically upset the balance.
A young child who is getting optimal care has a balance in the brain chemistry. The chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are called excitatory, are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. And then the chemicals about I'm safe, I'm fed, I'm loved, we call those inhibitory, come into play. And so this child has excitatory but then inhibitory. So there's a balance in the brain chemistry. If a child has early trauma or harm, even brief early trauma or harm, these systems become imbalanced so that I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm scared, I'm lonely takes precedence. And there's very little of what would come when the needs were met. For children that we have seen over the years, and we've done neurotransmitter tests to test the level of this chemistry on more than 2,500 children. And what we find is dramatic levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, dopamine, beta-phenylethylamine, norepinephrine. We find glutamate that causes seizures very high in many of the children.
And research shows these imbalances also raise the risk for mental health issues and lots of behavioral issues. The takeaway message is this: trauma damages the brain, especially a young developing brain. It alters brain structure and upsets the delicate balance of brain chemistry that drives behavior. It puts a child at risk for a lifetime of problems.
I'm sorry.
But if you know the risk factors that predispose a child to harm, you'll be in a better position to quickly intervene and minimize the damage.
Now that you know a little bit about where our kids come from and how they may react, here is how we would like for you to respond. Our charge to you is to love your kids. With some kids, it's easy to love them. With others, it may seem a bit harder. However, every kid needs to know that you care about them for any relationship to develop. Give the kids perhaps even their very first taste of unconditional love. Love even the difficult kid. Provide security. Security is a priority, especially for our kids. If they do not feel safe, they cannot trust you. Oftentimes, the places these kids come from don't feel super safe to them. The way that we love for, care for, respect, and show consistency to the kids can provide security for them at camp. Know your camper. Listen to them, ask them questions, and learn about them. Get to know their dislikes and their likes. Find out things like their favorite activity, or get to know some of the triggers for them at camp. For instance, perhaps your camper is having a hard time going to chapel. Ask them questions, figure out why. Perhaps it's something that will have an easy solution. Getting to know each camper as an individual will help us to provide the best experience for them at camp.
These next things we'll be going over are ways to help build trust in a relationship with your camper. Differentiate the child from the behavior. Their behavior is not their identity. They hear that they're bad from so many people in their lives, and we want to be encouraging at camp and have a different sort of environment than the ones that they're used to. Make directions clear and short, specific, and know that there's a good chance you'll need to repeat them. And so a lot of our kids have a really short attention span, so they're not doing this to be difficult. They just truly need you to be patient with them. And so just don't get frustrated in that process. Meet them where they are. So that could include if they're laying on the ground because they're having a hard time, then sitting on the ground next to them. We never want to be towering over the kids or anything, but we want to be on their same eye level to get eye contact with them. Communicate the plan. As you get to know them, you can think of solutions specific to them that will help the problem to not escalate. Praise correct responses. So we want to be encouraging to our kids and just include an encouraging atmosphere at camp. And so a lot of times, the more encouraging you are to them, the more attention they're getting, and so it'll just continue to be better behavior. Set them up for success. If a kid struggles with going somewhere, give them something to look forward to afterwards. And so if they're having a hard time at art, then maybe if you know that the basketball court is by art, then you can have a compromise for going to art for half the time and then getting to play basketball afterwards. So just get to know your kid. The more you learn about them, the more you'll be able to come up with ways that will set them up for success. Help the child develop their own strategies. A lot of the kids know if they struggle with anger or have other problems consistently at school or at home. And so a lot of the times people have already helped them come up with different strategies. And so we just need to be learners of things that they know that already help them. And if they don't have anything, then we can help them come up with their own ideas. Whether that's counting to 10, whether that's just taking really deep breaths, there's lots of different ways. Recognize that the child is going to have difficult days. Sometimes we're at camp for a long time or sometimes we're not, but within that, there is definitely a possibility that your camper will be having a difficult day. And so just not taking it personally and just continuing to pray with them and to serve together. When your camper is having a difficult day, these are some things that you should be doing all throughout camp that will be helpful, and also the process of how to begin handling the difficult problems or behavior problems that they might be having. So the first thing is connect. So everyone should be connecting with their camper all throughout camp. This can happen on many different levels. Some examples are finding out you both like basketball, finding out you're both the oldest sibling. So these are just ways to connect with your camper and to help build that trust and relationship. And it'll help you out a lot down the line to know key things that you can bring up and talk about when you are empowering and correcting. So the next thing is empower. So we want to involve them in their correction process. So if, for instance, if they started to get into a fight on the basketball court, we want to be able to empower them and say, hey, do you think that was a good idea to do that? Or what is a better response that you maybe should have had to that bad reaction? And so we want to empower them to know that they can respond in positive ways and help teach them how. And so then that builds into the correct phase. So we want to empower them in their own behavior, but then also teaching them the correct response and helping them come up with it also. So this could include compromises, giving them choices. We really want them to put it in the process and to practice this also. And so if they had almost gotten into a fight and maybe they said, well, maybe an apology might be good. Well, let's go apologize to that person. And so walking them through that process, making sure they look them in the eyes, they're doing it in a respectful way. Just practicing that correct response can help build that in them so then they can do that on their own the next time. And then at the end of all this, we always want to end with playful engagement too, like maybe throwing in a joke or just getting more of a lighthearted feeling so you're not ending with that they feel like they just got in trouble and they're the worst kid ever. So we want to coach them through this.
Whether your camper is having a difficult day or a good day, there are different ways to respond to your camper, and we're going to go over the ideal response. First, the I stands for immediate. We want our response to be launched within the first few seconds. If a child is calling out to you, please respond to them as soon as possible. You should be aware of what is going on with your camper and where they are and able to respond immediately. Next, it needs to be direct. Be within proximity and gain eye contact with them and get on their level. Our kids oftentimes do not get a response from the people around them, so being present and on their level shows that we care about them. Next, we want to be efficient. We want this to be a measured response. We do not need to overreact. Try to monitor voice, pitch, tone, and body language. We want to be using our response as a model for how we want their responses to be. We also want our response to be action-based. There's always an opportunity for a redo. Work on strategies and routines with them. Always reward with specific praise and encouragement. This is not behavior modification. This is understanding the reason behind the action. And then last, we want to be leveled at the behavior, not the child. We are all created in God's image. Remember that their behavior is not their identity. They are a child that is precious to God. And the consequences we have are not to punish the camper for being a bad person, but to help them build healthy habits, not just for camp, but also for all of life. The ideal response we just went over is a response we would want you to use for most situations at camp. However, now we're going to go over some things that are never acceptable at camp and then how to handle some more aggressive situations. So first, what's never acceptable? Corporal punishment. We are never going to do punishment that involves physical contact. No hitting, shoving, any of that. Next, we're not going to withhold food or water. Some of our kids do not get enough food or have trauma relating to food. And so at times when food is available to them, we're not going to use that as a punishment by withholding it. And if there's a time that they might be running behind but they need water, go ahead and let them get water. It's more important than getting to the activity. Third, belittling or name calling. There are times that there are things that we may think are harmless, nicknames or just calling someone a name, something you might do with your friends, but it can be more destructive for these kids. For instance, there's some destructive language that we don't want to use at camp, such as you shouldn't do that, or that's stupid, you're being immature, or you're ridiculous. Instead, we want to use relational language. How about instead of you shouldn't do that, we say, in what ways could we do this different? Instead of saying, you're immature, show me how you can be mature, say, what is a better choice you could make in this situation? Or for instance, you get to choose. By your choice, you can control whether you have the consequence or not. That's a lot better than things such as you are good or bad or worthless or life's not fair. Instead, we are showing them ways to relate to us using kind language instead of belittling or name calling. Within that, there's also sarcasm. Our kids don't receive sarcasm the way that we or our friends might. So we need to speak life into our kids and just try to avoid sarcasm as they don't always understand it. There are other times that there may be aggressive situations. We're going to figure out good ways to handle those. First, you're going to get help. You should never be alone with a child, and you don't have to handle a tough situation on your own. So go ahead and pull in a support crew or maybe a staff member. Next, you want to remain calm and in control. Yes, some of these situations can be scary and you may want to panic or freak out, but it's going to be harder to get the control back. So just remain calm. We're going to help you take care of the situation. Next, you want to remove the child from an instigating situation. For example, other difficult children. Perhaps someone said something negative to them and that made them want to fight them. Don't keep them near that child. Instead, take the two campers out of eyeshot, out of earshot. That way you can talk to them and show them that you care without them still being upset about the situation. Then you want to acknowledge the child and their actions. Express to them that you want to understand what their actions mean and encourage them to use their words to share with you what happened. You can clearly communicate it is their choices that empower them to choose both their actions and, as a result, the consequences of those actions. During all of this, you want to be aware of your tone, your volume, and rate of how you are talking. We went over this in the ideal response. We don't want to model to them a behavior that we don't want them to use, like yelling. We don't need to yell at them if we don't want them to yell. Next, you want to respect the child's personal space. No matter what's going on, we're not going to get in their face. We're not going to grab them. None of that. We want to respect their personal space so that they can continue to trust us in the situation. Make sure you're also using eye contact and facial expressions that are appropriate to this situation. The kids may say something that makes you want to roll your eyes, like blaming a different kid for something that they did. However, we want to be still in control and doing behavior that they're going to respect us, so they know that we respect them as well. At the end of all of this, once we've kind of de-escalated the situation, there is going to need to be a consequence, but we want that to be equal to the behavior. If it's something more minor, perhaps they're not going to be allowed to participate for a little bit in a favored activity. So that could be like, making a compromise and they have to sit out 5 minutes from swimming or something like that. However, if it's a more aggressive situation, like a physical fight, at that point in time, we may need to allow crew or staff to help come up with a more serious consequence, for instance, sitting out of activity to clean a bathroom. And if the behavior continues and it continues to be aggressive, then staff members can call parents or even send the kid home if it gets that serious.
Here, we just want to give you a reminder and give you some useful tools to remember while you're at camp. And so we want to be consistent. So that's being consistent with the rules. And so if you told them not to do something once, then you want to make sure that you continue through with that. Otherwise, they might get really confused and misobey when they don't even mean to. The next thing is compromises. So compromises are really helpful in transitions or if they're trying to correct a behavior. And so some examples of that are you can do something for 1 more minute, then we can leave and go to the next activity. This is a really good correction tool. The next thing is to give choices. This makes them feel valued and heard, but the choices are always still within limits. And so don't give them a choice of something that they actually couldn't have even done. Or if an activity is already over, not giving them that choice to go back to the activity. So an example of this is, do you want to race to club or just walk? Or do you want to read a book during FOB or make bracelets? So choices empower them to choose things. And so this is a great way because then they chose that, so then they can follow through on that choice. The next thing is cool down techniques. So some examples of this are breathing, taking a walk, playing a game until they're ready to talk about what just happened. And so a lot of our kids do deal with anger, and so we want to help teach them how to regulate themselves. So ask them what helps them. So many already know ways that help them, and so we can learn from them and then remind them of these things. And then asking them to use their words. If they're upset or frustrated, it might be hard to know what happened or know how they're feeling. So just reminding them to use their words can help you understand the situation, and it shows that you care. Another thing is just, we already went over the ideal response, and so just remembering that we want you to be responding ideally in all of these situations that you'll be at camp, whether you're just having fun or whether it is more handling an aggressive situation. And the last thing is playful engagement. Camp is meant to be a fun environment. When problems do come up, we want to first try to redirect the situation in a playful way. So this could be like joking with them or something. Then obviously if that doesn't work, becoming more serious might be necessary. That's it for this training. Let us know if you have any questions about what we talked about, whether you're confused or just are interested in more details about these things. And then also at camp, we'll have more time for training where we'll role play different common scenarios that can be useful just to help show ways to handle these problems. So we'll give examples of things that kids might do and then ways to respond ideally, how to connect to power, all those different things.